So it's knife-edge time, isn't it? Government officials and British Steel staff in a desperate race against time to save Scunthorpe steel plant from closure. It still does not have the raw materials to keep those two blast furnaces burning.
Well, Treasury Minister James Murray joins us now from Westminster. Good morning to you.
Morning.
The Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has talked about this. He says that there's no guarantee that this fuel will arrive in time to keep the furnaces burning. So why not a guarantee then? Can you bring us up to date on that? How are we looking with getting that coking coal to the furnaces in time to make sure that they can keep burning?
Yes, no, thank you. Well, what I can explain is that we've got officials who are on site now as we speak, doing everything they can to get those raw materials into the blast furnaces to keep them going. You know, we've had officials involved on site since the legislation was passed in the House of Parliament on Saturday. And the only reason we're in this situation now, where the Business Secretary is able to get officials on site doing everything they can to get the raw materials to keep the blast furnaces going, is because we took that action. And if we hadn't taken that action at the weekend, we'd now be having a very different conversation where we'd be talking about why these blast furnaces closed already. Okay. So we're doing everything we can to keep them going. So
what do you think the chances are then that materials will get there in time to keep those furnaces going? Because obviously, you know, as we know and as we've been told by steel workers as well, that once they go out, that's it, isn't it?
Well, you're right that once they go out, it's much harder to restart them, and that's why it was such a priority for us to act quickly over the weekend, passing that legislation on Saturday, because what became apparent in the days running up to Saturday was that Garraway, the company who owns the plant, was behaving irresponsibly, and they were accelerating their plans to close the blast furnaces. So we had to act very quickly. That's why we went into Parliament on Saturday to pass that legislation, and why we're now able to act to secure the future of steelmaking in the UK.
You say act very quickly, but actually there are accusations that you've acted too late on this. There have been warnings for weeks, haven't there, about the fuel running out and the company's viability. Back in September, questions were raised by the Conservative MP Martin Vickers about coal imports. You've left it to the last minute, haven't you, to intervene on this? I mean, the clock is literally counting down.
Well, no, we've been working on this since the general election, working with Garraway, with the company involved. We made a very generous offer to them to keep the production going at Scunthorpe. What became apparent in the last few days, what's changed, is it's become clear that they've accelerated their plans to close the blast furnaces, and that's what became so urgent, because, as you rightly said, once the blast furnaces turned off, it's much harder to turn them back on. And we are absolutely serious about having a future for steel making here in the UK. We need that future for steel making for our national security, and also to support all of our plan for change in terms of building 1.5 million new homes, all the infrastructure we want to build, hospitals, railways, all of the stuff we want to do. We need to have steel making capacity in the UK to support that to happen. So that's why we decided to act quickly over the weekend, as I say, having that legislation in Parliament on Saturday. But that then gives us the opportunity to secure the long-term future in a sustainable way.
Well, it was an opportunity, and the question is, has it come in time, as Charlotte's asking there? Look, I've listened really carefully to everything you've said. I've also been reading the transcripts of interviews I've given to other media outlets earlier this morning, and taking into account them and other comments made by government spokesmen at the weekend, it strikes me that you're attempting to manage expectations here. You can't guarantee that the raw materials are going to arrive in time. You're unable to guarantee that. You can't say that to me now. Therefore, you're managing expectations and you're preparing us for failure. There's obviously a possibility, isn't there, that this stuff won't get there in time and those furnaces will go cold. Are you prepared to admit that?
So look, I realise what I'm going to say is going to be frustrating for you and possibly for some of your viewers, but there are commercial processes underway, and I don't want to say anything on your TV programme that undermines those commercial processes, okay? So those commercial processes are happening as we speak. I'm confident that all action is being taken to get those raw materials in place, but I don't want to undermine those processes that are underway.
In that case, I wouldn't dream of asking you to talk about those commercial processes, so let's push that off the table. It still leaves the question open, though, doesn't it? Whatever those processes may or may not be, you can't guarantee that they're going to work.
Well, as I say, I don't want to comment on those commercial processes because I don't want to undermine them. But the commercial processes are what's happening at the moment as part of the efforts to get the raw materials into the blast furnaces. You know, the reason why we have officials directed by the Secretary of State on site is because of what we did over the weekend. You know, we'd be having a very different conversation if we hadn't have taken those powers on Saturday. We'd be talking about why these blast furnaces closed. And the fact that we now have the officials on site trying to get the raw materials in there means that we can have a conversation instead about keeping them going and then the long-term future of steelmaking in the UK.
Well, on the principle of hoping for the best but preparing for the worst, if the furnaces do go cold and they can't be started up again without massive investment on relining them, as we've heard this morning, would the government be prepared to commit to doing that? You say that it's vital that we keep our steel industry, our virgin steel industry, going in this country. If these raw materials arrive in Scunthorpe too late, and you haven't been able to rule that out, and I understand why, but you haven't been able to rule it out, would the government commit to spending many, many more millions on relining the furnaces and starting them up again?
Well, all our efforts at the moment are on keeping them going. But let me talk directly about costs, because you rightly raised the question around costs, and it's ones that I'm sure a lot of your viewers will be interested in. Now, we know that Jingye has been losing around £233 million a year. That's what their annual accounts show. So we know that, you know, as the business secretary said over the weekend, we expect there to be a loss through our involvement. But the alternative, if we had let the blast furnaces close, if Jingye acting irresponsibly had led to the blast furnaces closing, that would have cost the taxpayer well over £1 billion in terms of intervening with land remediation, dealing with the issues of the workforce, and so on. So, you know, getting involved does have implications in terms of finances, but we think it's the best use of public money rather than having risked the blast furnaces closing with far greater cost and far greater long-term impact on steel making in the UK.
But isn't the case that, you know, we're unlikely to find a private partner to then team up with this because of the losses that you've mentioned that Jingye have already incurred? It's a loss-making plant, isn't it? Therefore, nationalisation seems inevitable. Taxpayers want to know what the financial implication of that is for them, because it's set to be billions, isn't it? Can we actually afford to do this? If we're looking at a country where we're cash-strapped with the NHS, we're cash-strapped with defence, people are finding it hard to pay for their energy bills. This country's in dire straits at the moment. Can we afford the billions needed?
So you're right to say that nationalisation is a likely outcome. The Business Secretary was clear about that over the weekend. It's also important to emphasise, though, that in the long term, we want to find a private sector partner who can co-invest with us and make sure we have a sustainable long-term future for steelmaking.
Sorry to interrupt, but looking at the figures, who is going to want to do that, though? You know, when it came to sort of looking for a partner before, Jingye was the only company who wanted to do it, and it's unlikely, looking at the figures and the losses that they've incurred, that anyone else would find it remotely interesting to invest in it.
Well, look, you know, today, right now, it is not a proposition that a private sector partner would want to invest in as we speak. As I say, the priority today is to keep the blast furnaces going. But what we need to do is find that long-term future. And you asked an important question a second ago about the money that's going in, about the government investment that is going in to keep the blast furnaces going. Now, this is all part of £2.5 billion, which we allocated at the last budget to steel, to protecting the future of steel in the UK. So that's money that's already been allocated. It's not drawing on other resources. It's identified to support steel in the UK. And that's why we think this is a good use of those resources to keep the blast furnaces going.
Minister, we're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question. I'm sure you maybe haven't had time to look at the front page of the Times newspaper this morning. I'd like to quote you the opening paragraph of their lead story. British steel should be the canary in the coal mine that forces ministers to remove Chinese companies from critical British infrastructure. Is that the case? I mean, a lot of people are pointing the finger at the Chinese government and are saying that they actually invested in this project in Scunthorpe in order eventually to close it down, so we'd have to import Chinese steel. If that's the case, and there's a lot of suspicion that that is the case, then it clearly has implications for other Chinese companies, well, we say companies, but they're really fronts for the Chinese government, investment and involvement here in Britain. Is it time to have a good, long look at that?
Well, look, there's no doubt that Jingye acted irresponsibly, but I don't think it's right to then say we can cast judgment on all Chinese companies. And actually, what we need to do is make sure that we're encouraging investment from around the world. We believe in free trade. We want to have that investment from around the world. But where there is foreign investment or foreign involvement in critical infrastructure, whatever country that comes from, there should be a high level of scrutiny. And I think more widely, our relationship with China should be, open-eyed, pragmatic. We realise that China is our fourth biggest trading partner. There are 450,000 jobs in the UK that depend on exports to China. We need to have that balanced relationship where in some areas we work together, in other areas we compete, and in further areas we challenge them. But I think there's that balanced relationship of encouraging investment, but when it's national infrastructure, critical infrastructure, we need a high level of scrutiny, whatever country that money is coming from.
James Murray, Treasury Minister, thanks for your time this morning.